So we're going to try to understand the human brain. So even though I did just poke fun at cognitive neuroscientists a little bit, by the end of this hour you will all be duly deputized cognitive neuroscientists right along there with me, okay? So we're all going to do this together. So it looks like my slides are not coming up, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started, and we'll just do this from memory. Ironically, right? So we're going to be trying to talk about 4 things in particular today. So number 1, we're going to talk about what memory is and where it lives in the brain. Number 2, we're going to talk about what Alzheimer's disease is and how that affects the brain. The 3rd thing we're going to talk about is some of the latest research in aging and Alzheimer's disease. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a little bit of information on how to age gracefully. So it's a little bit of a palate cleanser because some of the other parts of the talk can feel a little intense when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease. So we're going to go and get started by talking about what is involved. And I'm sorry, you're going to have to imagine that this blue screen is a lovely deck of slides. We're going to pretend that it's lovely. That is going to talk about what memory is and what memory does, okay? So when we think of how memory should work in our brains, I think a lot of us tend to imagine a video camera in our heads, right? You sort of say, all right, what was I doing last Friday night? You rewind back to Friday night at 7 p.m. and you just hit play in your head and you kind of go from there. One thing that we've learned, and maybe it's just one thing that we've learned in about 125 years of memory research, is that is not true. That's not correct at all. Memory is in no way a video camera. It's not what we call a veridical recall system, which is just a fancy way of saying your memory's not as good as you think it is, and it never has been. So memory is itself a much different kind of mechanism, much different kind of process than we're aware of. So instead of thinking about a video camera, instead of thinking about some kind of recording device, the metaphor that I like to use is that memory is much more like Lego. Much more like Lego than it is any kind of recording device. So memories have to be built piece by piece. They have to be reassembled. They have to be recovered bit by bit when you retrieve a memory later on. And just to give you a flavor of what a Lego memory looks like, I usually like to give an example. So how many of you are familiar with that feeling of having something on the tip of your tongue? Right? So you're seeing that movie with that actor, and you know that he's been in like another film with that other actress from the 90s, and his name starts with T, and it's just one syllable, and his last name has just one other syllable, and it starts with a consonant of some kind, and you know exactly what he looks like, but the name just eludes you. You can describe everything else around this individual, all the other movies that he's been in. You can talk about how many kids he's had, how many kids he has, the last time you saw him in a movie theater, but you can't come up with the name Tom Hanks, for example. So that's who I was thinking of. I don't know if anyone else got that. But so that tip of the tongue phenomenon was actually our first clue as neuroscientists, that memory wasn't this all or none process. And it wasn't even a process that was something that could be warped from piece by piece. It was really something that had to be built, like some kind of Lego object or Lego device. So if you remember one thing, remember that memory is much more like Lego than a video camera. So if we are going to be thinking about the brain, where is that Lego house? Where is that Lego memory? If it's not exactly what we thought it was. So this is the part where I'm going to teach you neuroanatomy. Normally I have a gigantic picture on the slide, but we're just going to use my head because as far as I can tell, I have a brain too, and we're going to make it work. So just a quick tour of the human brain. So I'm known what is known as a cognitive neuroscientist. So what that means is that I care about like the big, squishy, wrinkly parts of the brain. There are other parts of the brain called the cerebellum and the brainstem. They regulate really unimportant things like your heart rate and breathing, all of your involuntary actions and stuff like that. So we don't care about those. What cognitive neuroscientists do care about are the 4 big lobes of the brain. So who knows one of the lobes of the brain?
Frontal.
Frontal lobe, exactly. So where do you think your frontal lobe is? It's behind your forehead. You know, again, cognitive neuroscientists are intelligent people. We are not a creative people. So the frontal lobe is right here at the front of your head. So the frontal lobe is actually really important for a lot of different kinds of functions. It's the part of your brain that makes you you. It's the home to parts of your personality. It's home to all of your thinking and your attentional resources. So if all of you are paying attention to me, you're engaging your frontal lobes. Then again, I've also done research on mind wandering. So if you're paying attention to me like half the time, you are right on track. So don't worry about that. So who can name another lobe of the brain? We talked about the frontal lobe that's right here. There are 3 more. Occipital lobe. See, the occipital lobe is in the back of your head, right here. And the occipital lobe is fully 1/4 of your brain, and the role that plays is in human vision. So even though it's the part of your brain that's in the back of your head, it's the part that helps you see.
I'm sorry. So when your voice goes down, I really
Yes.
don't hear it. So could you just say that again?
So it's the part of your brain that helps you see.
See.
See, yes, with your eyes. So the occipital lobe is in the back of your head, and it actually regulates a large amount of visual processing. It's actually so complex that we can't replicate it with machines. With all of our fancy Google devices, we can't make a robot see as well as a 1-year-old child can, in terms of being able to differentiate objects. So we've named 2 of the lobes of the brain. Does anyone know the other 2? Any guesses? There's a temporal lobe, exactly. And the temporal lobe is the one that is home to memory. It's where memories are not stored, but that you can, I think a better way of saying it is that this is where memories are reassembled. Okay? So the temporal lobe is home to 3 regions. It's home to several regions, but 3 regions that we're going to be talking about today. And those 3 regions are the entorhinal cortex, the parahippocampal formation, and the hippocampus. Okay? Who's heard of at least one of those regions before? Okay, so many of you have probably heard of the hippocampus, right? Okay, great, you're right on track. So those 3 regions together, the hippocampus, the parahippocampal formation, and the entorhinal cortex, all combine to create something called the medial temporal lobe. The medial temporal lobe. And the medial temporal lobe is where memories are rebuilt. Each one of those regions plays a slightly different role in how the memory is reassembled, but together, this is where our Lego pieces go to kind of be rebuilt into a Lego memory. The reason why it's important to talk about the medial temporal lobe is because it's the heart of the aging process. If we think about how the brain changes with age, you might think that, well, as I'm getting older, I'm probably losing some brain cells. I don't know where I'm losing brain cells from, but they're important ones, right? So you might think that the brain sort of shrinks uniformly with age, but it doesn't. Some parts of the brain change remarkably different from other parts. So for example, we were talking about the frontal lobe earlier. There's a subsection of the frontal lobe called the prefrontal cortex, or the lateral prefrontal cortex, if you're going to be very, very specific. The lateral prefrontal cortex changes with age in much the way that you think it would. So if you were graphing it over time, you would see that if you're 20 years old, the size of your lateral prefrontal cortex is here, and then as you get older, it just sort of shrinks at a relatively steady rate. And unfortunately, the bad news is that it was biggest when you were 20. So that's all of us in the room that are on the wrong side of that particular curve. So the lateral prefrontal cortex shrinks at a relatively uniform rate as we get older. However, there are parts of your brain that don't change appreciably with age at all. So for example, the occipital lobe. There's a part of the occipital lobe called the primary visual cortex. And if you were to graph that over time, it would be about this big when you're 20, and then as you got older, it stays about the same size. So the occipital lobe is the same size when you're 90 as when you're 20. It doesn't change. So we know from those two comparisons that some parts of the brain change, some parts of the brain don't. So what about this medial temporal lobe? What do you think is going to happen there? We know it's where memories are formed. So I would like to hear some guesses. What do you think would happen? Does it change? Does it not change with age? Changes. Everybody's very sure that it changes with age.
It gets better.
Oh, some people think it gets better.
Well, you use it more.
Right, so you do use it more. So we've got some guesses saying it gets better, some people saying it's probably getting worse, based on my memory for names and faces. The truth is that all of you are right. So what happens is that the region, the medial temporal lobe, stays about the same. It gets a little bit bigger, and it stays roughly the same between the ages of 18 and about 45. So you have a little bit of a bump there in your 30s, and it starts to decline very slowly. And then when you enter your 50s, it starts declining, and then in your 60s, it declines even faster. In your 70s, it declines faster still, and in your 80s, it declines faster than that. The good news is after your 80s, it pretty much levels off, so you don't have much more to lose, literally in this case. But it's what we call a curvilinear function. The relationship between age and the size of the medial temporal lobe is a curvilinear function. And if some of you are kind of put off by my scientific talk, curvilinear function is just a fancy word that means a curvy line. It's a line that's not straight, it's curvy. That's why we say curvilinear. So what that means is that the one part of your brain that changes, declines, the fastest with age is the medial temporal lobe. This is why you have memory problems as you get older. Because the part of your brain that is the most susceptible to age-related change is the part of your brain where memories are reassembled. And it's why some of those memories just pop back sometimes. If you go into another room, if you try to leave it alone and come back later, if you start singing a song, all of that comes back because those Lego pieces are intact. It's just putting the whole thing together that has been compromised. Okay? So, without any slides, without any help, we've already gotten through our first couple of points for today's talk. So we're making really good time. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's talk about Alzheimer's disease. Okay? So when we think about Alzheimer's disease, most of us think about what? What do you think of when you hear Alzheimer's disease?
The memory you have, one thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can't function on your own.
You think about not being able to function on your own. You think about memory problems. What else? What else do people think about? Deterioration?
When is the time that you start not remembering names that you hear 2 seconds before?
Yeah, that's a great
You
question.
can remember everything else.
But you can't remember names. It turns out that remembering names and faces is one of the hardest kinds of memory tasks that there is. And that's because names and faces are both very arbitrary pieces of information. It's because if you have this face, it can have any name. And if you have this name, it can have any face. So it's really hard to get those two things to bind together, especially if somebody has a common name or especially if they have a common face. So that's why it becomes difficult, and it becomes more difficult as you move through your 40s into your 50s, because the part of your brain that's responsible for binding that information is in the parahippocampal formation. So one of the 3 regions of the medial temporal lobe. So that's all to do with normal aging, however. Now let's talk about Alzheimer's disease, okay? So when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, most scientists nowadays have agreed that we should move beyond thinking about the symptoms. We shouldn't think about memory loss or wandering behavior or not being able to take care of yourself. We should think about physical changes that happen in the brain. What happens in the brain when it comes to Alzheimer's disease? And there are 2 big factors in play, okay? So there are two proteins. So we're not done with the neuroanatomy yet. I'm sorry. I'm going to make you guys work over the next hour. So who has heard of any of the proteins that are involved in Alzheimer's disease? Any guesses? Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's TAU.
Yeah, so tau. Tau is a protein that's very important. And who can remember the other one? So tau is the one that people normally don't get, so I'm pretty impressed. Which one is a little bit more common? What's the other one?
I knew, but I can't remember.
Okay, you're at 42, something along those lines. Okay, so we've got these two proteins, and you know it's really it's very abstract to talk about proteins in the brain. So I usually like to give a couple of very concrete examples that are reasonably accurate. So when it comes to amyloid, does everybody know what saran wrap is, cling film? Okay, so if you are making yourself, like maybe you'll be doing it this weekend because it's Memorial Day, if you're making some potato salad and you need to put the potato salad in your fridge, you'll pull out the cling film, you'll tear it, you'll put the cling film on your bowl of potato salad and stick it in the fridge, and you've done a hero's work, right? You're good to go. What happens if you're bad at cling film? What happens if you're the Jonathan Jackson of saran wrap? It clings together, right? You also can't really tear it, right? So you usually end up having to like rip it off, and like I'm also really cheap, so I want to save that cling film. But is that usually possible? Can you untangle it and use it again? Usually you can't, right? I mean, there's one gentleman who's nodding, so God bless you. You are a mensch if you're able to untangle that saran wrap, but most of us can't. So we have to say goodbye to those 3.5 or 4 cents every time. So a very similar process happens in the brain when it comes to amyloid buildup. Okay, so amyloid is supposed to be a very specific length, a specific length of amino acids. And when that process goes wrong, it gets torn or clipped at the wrong length. And when it gets done at the wrong length, it springs back on itself. It sticks only to itself, and it forms a clump or a plaque. It forms an amyloid plaque. So if you've heard of the amyloid plaque, it's because the saran wrap process has gone wrong. Your brain can't make it tear at the right length, so it crumbles up on itself. And normally when you're young, this process happens rarely, and your brain is very, very good at clearing that stuff out, especially when you sleep. But as you get older, that cleaving process becomes more error prone. So you end up tearing and messing up that saran wrap more and more and more frequently. And it becomes these little balls that get stuck in your brain, and your brain can no longer cope with clearing them out. So it builds up and it starts to choke off the brain cells as it fills it up with all of this junk, this saran wrap that we call amyloid. That's where the other protein comes in, tau, T-A-U. Oh, and for those of you who are taking notes, amyloid is spelled A-M-Y, like Amy, and then Lloyd, L-O-I-D, amyloid. So tau, T-A-U, is another protein that's really involved in maintaining the rigidity of cell walls. So we can actually think of this as like a regular wall. Do you guys remember, I guess it was about 3 years ago when we had that awful snowstorm, one right after another, like every weekend for like weeks on end. And then when the snow all melted, we all had to deal with ice dams and water damage. Who had to deal with some water damage in your homes at any point? Oh, you guys were all really lucky, right? So if your home does get water damage, let's talk about your wall. So let's say your wall gets water damage and there's a big brown stain on it. Can you just paint over that stain, return the wall to its normal color? Why can't you do that?
You can't seal it. You need something like a shellac first.
Right, so the wall needs to be fixed, it needs to be repaired. You can't just paint over it because the damage is not just cosmetic. Very similar process happens with the tau protein in our brain. It becomes what we call hyperphosphorylated, which means a phosphate group gets added to this protein, and that sort of poisons the tau. And what it means that it can't do is that it can't maintain the rigidity of those cell walls. It unravels. And so the tau attacks brain cells from within, causes them to unravel. That leaves the amyloid free to swing in, and it takes out a brain cell. It causes a brain cell to have effectively a tiny seizure. It has an excitatory toxic response. And that's the death of a brain cell. The combination of amyloid and tau that leads to a destruction of brain cells is the official definition of Alzheimer's disease. It has nothing to do with changes in memory or changes in your behavior. That is not, strictly speaking, Alzheimer's disease. That is a dementia that is associated with Alzheimer's disease. Okay? So, to briefly summarize, the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia is that Alzheimer's disease refers to these plaques and tangles that build up in the brain. Dementia is an umbrella term. You can have dementia for lots of reasons. You can have dementia because you're depressed. You can have dementia because you are sleep deprived. You can have dementia because you're an alcoholic or because of vascular reasons. Sometimes you can reverse the symptoms of dementia if you take a nap. Sometimes you can't. So saying that you have dementia is like saying that you have a headache, right? So sometimes the dementia is due to a serious cause, and sometimes it's due to a reversible cause. The same would be true for a headache. So dementia is a symptom of Alzheimer's disease, but not all dementias are Alzheimer's disease. Does that make sense? There are 100 causes of dementia. The leading cause of dementia for older adults is Alzheimer's disease, but it's not the only one. Okay? All right. So we've talked a little bit about Alzheimer's disease. We've talked a little bit about how it works in the brain. But where does Alzheimer's disease tend to strike? How does it affect our brains? Does it kind of affect the brain everywhere at once? Or does it affect the brain kind of differentially? Does it sneak in one particular spot, build a stronghold, and move out from there? It turns out that Alzheimer's disease tends to start in a part of the brain called the entorhinal cortex. It then moves through the parahippocampal formation and really takes root in the hippocampus. So the earliest known signs of Alzheimer's disease, again using this definition of amyloid and tau, is that it starts in that medial temporal lobe that we've been talking about. So does that make sense? All right. So the same parts of your brain that are susceptible to age-related decline are the same parts of your brain that are unusually susceptible to Alzheimer's disease. So a big question that kind of emerges, which is, well, what are we supposed to do with that information? If we have memory problems, how do we know if it's aging or Alzheimer's disease? And the answer is, this is why if you go to see your primary care doctor, she might just shrug her shoulders and say, well, I don't know. I don't know if you have normal memory problems or if these are serious ones. The reason why is because just by looking at the symptoms, we can't tell. In order to be for sure, we would need to look at these proteins in the brain. There are a couple of ways to do that, only one of which is commercially available or clinically available. And it turns out that you can actually look at the amyloid in your brain. There are, I think, 4 tracers that have been approved since 2012. The first one was called Amyvid, and it's not currently reimbursable by insurance or Medicare or Medicaid. But if you really want to know if you've got amyloid in your brain, there is now an option available for the low cost of about $3,000. So if any of you guys have that lying around, then that's an option for you. Otherwise, you can just, you can spend it on me. You can take me out to dinner or something. But when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, I want to speak to this gentleman's question from earlier, which is, gosh, when does it start? If you start having those days of forgetfulness, does that mean the Alzheimer's disease has been in your brain for like a month? Has it been in your brain for a year? It turns out that it's been in your brain for probably 15 years by that point, maybe as much as 20 years, before you start having those first days of forgetfulness. it sits in your brain for a really, really long time. So imagine, for example, having untreated high blood pressure for 15 or 20 years, not before you get help, but before you say, maybe I should go to the doc. Imagine having diabetes untreated for 15 or 20 years before you start to think that something is wrong. That's where we are with Alzheimer's disease. That's exactly where we are with the Alzheimer's disease. And why it's so tough to treat, why it's so tough to cure, is because right now we think that we're intervening way too late in the disease course. We're waiting until somebody, yes sir?
What does diet have to do with this?
So I'm going to get to diet in a few minutes when we get to the happier part of how to age gracefully. Turns out that diet has quite a lot to do with Alzheimer's disease and your risk. So I've got some good news for you. We actually have some clear science for a change. However, when it comes to the 10 leading causes of death, I just wanted to kind of emphasize this for you. When it comes to the 10 leading causes of death in the United States, for the year ending 2016, Alzheimer's disease ranks where? So for this is for all adults, not just older adults.
5,
Getting closer.
6.
I think 10.
Okay, so the answer is that right now it ranks 6th. It's the 6th leading cause of death, and this is for all adults. This is for all Americans, not just even all adults. This is for everybody. There are a few things to remember about that particular number, though. Number one is that in 1999 it was 10, and between 1999 and just 10 years later, it moved up to 6th on that list. And there's a few reasons for that. We can get into that during the Q&A if you want. But it has moved up rapidly on the list. It is the only one of the top 10 leading causes of death that can't be slowed, prevented, or treated right now. The other 10, you can do something about all of them. The other thing is that there has been a relatively sharp increase in what's known as the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. So this is the total number of people who have it. So between 1999 and 2014, there was a 55% increase in the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in the United States.
What were those years?
Between 1999 and 2014, there was a 55% increase in the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease.
Was part of that reason that people are living longer than they were?
Yes. So if you look at, so when it comes to these sorts of things, you can look at two different numbers. One is the prevalence and one is the incidence. The prevalence is the total number of people who have it. The incidence is the proportion out of every 100 people who have it. So that incidence number can change, but if you have a lot of people, that prevalence can go up. It is thought that in many developed countries, many what you would call first world countries, are seeing a reduction in the incidence of Alzheimer's disease, so that proportion out of 100, because we're getting much better at treating things like cancer and heart disease. We're getting much better at treating diabetes and catching it earlier. And it turns out if you don't have these things, then you are at lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or dementia. Because having high blood pressure, being a lifetime smoker, all of these things affect your brain in the long term. So it turns out that we are improving in the incidence, but because the baby boomers are up until I think this year, they have been the largest generation in America, the overall prevalence keeps climbing. So there are more people that can get Alzheimer's disease than they are. But it's not just due to the fact that we're getting better at treating other things. It's not just due to the fact that people aren't dying of these other things, so they die of Alzheimer's disease. If you chart the data reported by the Centers for Disease Control between 2014 and 2015, normally in 1 year, there's only about a change of about 3%, plus or minus, for every leading cause of death in the top 10. In 1 year, Alzheimer's disease increased by 11% in the United States. And between 2015 and 2016, there was another significant change. And I don't know if any of you heard about this in the news last December, but It was the first year in many years that they had revised life expectancy in the United States down by two-tenths of a year for men and about 1/10 of a year for women. The reason why was largely attributable to the opioid epidemic that has really ravaged the United States. But if you look at the report issued by the CDC, it was actually two causes that revised that trend downward. One was the opioid epidemic. The second one was Alzheimer's disease. So we are really on the verge of a public health crisis when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. And so I usually talk about all of these things to help give you a sense of hope around the latest research that we have in Alzheimer's disease. And so I want to kind of walk you through a few really cool findings that would again be cooler if we had some slides, but since we don't, you'll just have to put on your thinking caps and imagine along with me. So the first thing that I want to talk about is genetics. Okay, so I know it's 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the afternoon. I've already put you to work thinking about neuroanatomy, and now I'm going to teach you about genetics. Oh boy, all right. So because I am a very simple-minded individual and I need to come up with concrete metaphors to explain the work that I do to myself, I'm going to share these secrets with you. So when we talk about genetics, we need to think about probabilities, right? And so probabilities are hard. We're really not good at understanding probabilities because we sort of think, over a certain percentage, it's definitely going to happen. Under a certain percentage, it's definitely not going to happen. But it turns out that we think in probabilities all the time, and we do so consciously. So I'm going to give you an example, and I think you will all be able to relate to it. So if I were to say, I am no longer Jonathan Jackson, cognitive neuroscientist, but I am Jonathan Jackson, Channel 5 weatherman, and I say, truly I say to you, there is an 80% chance of rain later this afternoon. How many of you are going to plan for rain? Are you going to bring your umbrella, your poncho, anything along those lines? Are you guys gonna do that, or are you gonna risk it? Okay, so there's lots of nods in the room. Okay, there are a few brave souls who didn't react. I don't know if you're just being shy or if they're gonna say that you're gonna kind of brave your chances, but God bless you if you do it. So, if I were to come back and say, you know what, I'm Channel 5 weatherman Jonathan Jackson, I'm so sorry. I said 80%. I meant there was a 10% chance of rain. So who's gonna bring their umbrella and plan for rain? Okay, so there's a couple of you. 10% is too risky, right? That means that it does rain 10% of the time. So it doesn't hurt to have that umbrella. However, most of the rest of you would never do it, right? There's no need to. Here's the tricky one, and I do want everyone to respond this time. If I say, I'm Channel 5 weatherman, and there is a 35% chance of rain today, what are you gonna do? Who's gonna bring their umbrella? Okay, so the funny joke that I get to see that you don't is that every time I do this, there's always somebody in the audience who does this, and I don't know what that means if you're trying to bring an umbrella or not bring it. Like maybe just bring the top part and leave the bottom part at home, I'm not sure. But that's what we talk about when it comes to genetics. When it comes to genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease, a lot of us are in that 35% range, which means on the basis of your genetic risk alone, some people get it, most people don't. And it's really hard to say on the basis of just what genes you have. So yes, you are at increased risk if you have certain genetic mutations. Yes, you are at increased risk if you have an immediate family history. So if we're talking about your aunt or your grandparent, that doesn't count as immediate. Has to be an immediate family only. But how much does that affect your risk? It's hard to say. If your risk goes up by 8 times, but you're only at a 1% risk, you're now dealing with an 8% risk, which is not appreciable. If you were at a 5% risk and now you're at 40, then that is like a substantial change. So when it comes to talking about genetics, it's really, really hard to keep it all straight because it is probability based. So when I say that in recent years, there has been recent advances in something called a polygenic risk score. This is the kind of space that I'm talking about. So what is a polygenic risk score? So you can break the word down, if you remember some of your Latin and your Greek, is that you can break down, so poly means many, and genic just means genes. So a polygenic risk score just means you put a bunch of genes together and you look at the risk when you add them all up. And if you can do about 13 to 27 different genes, depending on your family, you can predict with some certainty not just whether you're going to get Alzheimer's disease, but when, within about a year. This is only for research purposes now, so you have to sign up for a research trial to have this stuff done. But the hope is that we can get good enough at this to use it in the clinic. And so when you are 35 or when you're 40 or when you're 45, you could have this genetic risk score done, and then you could have some peace of mind. Or you could try to start taking your brain Lipitor to ward off Alzheimer's disease. So that's one example of a really interesting development that's happened lately. Another example of something cool that people are doing are something called non-pharmacological interventions, which means they're trying to cure Alzheimer's disease without giving you a pill, without giving you a shot. There are a few different and interesting ways that this happens. So one is called ultrasound, focused ultrasound therapy. So you guys all know what ultrasound is. Like if you're pregnant, you kind of get the warm goose right on your belly, and they wave that little magic wand around, you get to see the baby. It turns out that you can slightly weaponize this technology by focusing the ultrasound and harnessing the resonant frequency of amyloid or of tau. And so if you strike the resonant frequency of anything, that's why a glass shatters when an opera singer sings. It's because her voice hits the resonant frequency of the glass, it vibrates in a way that it can't take, and it breaks apart. Same thing can be done for amyloid and for tau in the brain. Nothing else is affected. So when I first started talking about focused ultrasound, it was in 2015. And I had to say, this is a really exciting technology. You can do a lot of things with focused ultrasound. But this particular slide that I'm showing you is based on data from 10 rats. There was always this kind of sense of disappointment in the room, because it wasn't even 11 rats, it was 10. They hadn't even found an extra rat to try this on yet. I am actually pretty stoked to let you know that this particular therapy has moved very, very quickly. And so they actually enrolled their first patient, human patient, for a focused ultrasound clinical trial in humans a little over a year ago. So we will be hearing about the results of that probably this summer. And so if that moves ahead, then we can move to a phase 2 or a phase 3 trial, which means that it might be coming here. And instead of trying to go and take a pill for your brain, you can go and get some focused ultrasound. And it might make you much better for it. It turns out that this particular treatment is very effective. It works and is very safe in most mammals. As far as I can tell, I don't think there are any exceptions. But that's not the only really cool therapy that's on the block. There's another therapy that's related to optical imaging, which is basically a fancy way of saying we're going to shine a blue light in your eye at 40 hertz, and it's going to travel along your optic nerve, and it's going to break up all the amyloid and the tau that's in your brain. Nobody has any idea why this works or why it's particularly effective or what it is about the conductance of blue wave light along your optic nerve that works, but it seems to work. It seems that this optical light therapy works really well at breaking up the amyloid and tau in the brains of 10 rats. So we're kind of back at the 10 rat rule for this particular therapy. But my guess is that if it proves to be promising, that maybe when I come back next year, I can announce a human level clinical trial for this particular intervention too. So it's all really promising technology that we've got. Now, I was asked a little bit earlier about diet and what diet has to do with Alzheimer's disease. Because we all hear about different kinds of diets that we can do. We all hear about the South Peach diet or the Atkins diet or the paleo diet, and which one of these actually works? Well, one diet in particular has been very well studied when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. And I'm actually here to say it's the real deal. And I don't work for the diet company. I'm not getting any money for saying this. But the Mediterranean diet has been shown to be very effective, not just in lowering your risk for Alzheimer's disease, but also in slowing the rate of cognitive decline, even in normal aging. So some of you are nodding, and I think that you guys, because you are maybe on the Mediterranean diet. Some of you are probably wondering what's on the Mediterranean diet, and some of you look really sad because you know what's on the Mediterranean diet. So usually when I get to this part, people are like, okay, Jonathan, just hurry up, just tell me what's on the Mediterranean diet, better write it down. And this is where I look at you, deep into your eyes, and I say, you know what's on the Mediterranean diet. You've always known what's on the Mediterranean diet. It's the food that your doctor and that your family has been telling you to eat for years, and you keep responding, I'm not here for a long time, I'm here for a good time. You know what's on the Mediterranean diet. It is the vegetables, it's the dark leafy greens, you know, it's the fruit, it's the berries, it's the nuts. It means that you've got to give up the red meat in favor of fish and a little bit of poultry. You got to give up the butter in favor of olive oil. You know, if you are interested in that party life, and I know that some of you are, you can have dark chocolate, not milk. You can have red wine, not white. So there's a little bit of good news in there. But the Mediterranean diet is the diet that you know that you should have been sticking to all along, because it's the diet that's healthy for your body. It's a diet that's relatively healthy for your bones. It's very healthy for your heart. And it turns out that it's healthy for your brain too. So as much of that as you can get is good. My favorite study that was published 3 years ago. And it said, you know, if you stick to the Mediterranean diet for 4.5 years, you can cut your risk, and I'm going to give you an actual number, by 57%. So that is what we call a very large effect size. It's never too late to start. You're never too old to switch to the Mediterranean diet. 57%. That's not even my favorite number in the study. My favorite number in the study is the risk reduction for the people who were bad at the Mediterranean diet. The ones who go to the movie theater and get, you know, layered butter all over their popcorn. The ones that insist on having their rare steak once a week. You still saw a 34% risk reduction. So you cut your risk by about 1/3 by being bad at this diet. So really, there's no reason not to give it a shot. Like, even if you can do 1 meal a week that is Mediterranean friendly, your body will thank you. Obviously, then you should move on to 2 or 3, but if you can only do 1, then 1 will do you some good. So the Mediterranean diet is relatively well validated in humans. There are other diets that have been validated in animals, in mice, and pigs, and sheep, but have not been validated in humans. And those diets are this category of ketogenic diets and caloric restriction diets. It turns out that under caloric restriction, you can absolutely live to 125 years old. It is very well documented. But the question is, would you want to? Would you want to live to 125 if you're getting by on like 4,000 calories a day? You might, but you know, there is a quality of life trade-off. Now, the other diet was the ketogenic diet. Has anyone heard of the ketogenic diet before, or ketosis? So basically, the basic theory behind the ketogenic diet is that you cut out a lot of processed foods, you cut out all sugars, you basically detox your body. And what you do is you switch your body's primary fuel consumption from the glucose that you eat from your foods to ketosis, which burns the fat in your body, like the belly fat that we kind of accumulate through our lives. There are some side effects. Apparently your breath smells really bad if you do the ketogenic diet for long enough. But theoretically, this has not been evaluated in humans. Theoretically, the ketogenic diet may also reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease. This has been shown in animals, has not yet been shown in people. So just giving you a little bit of a selection of options there for those of you who are interested in diets.
Can you take any questions at this point or not?
Sure, I'll take some questions.
I've been diagnosed with early dementia, so if I happen to go on the Mediterranean diet, fully, completely really dedicate myself to it, what is the likelihood of the dementia reversing?
So the likelihood of it reversing is pretty slim to none, I would say. But if you really commit to something like the Mediterranean diet, along with a good exercise regimen and lots of social activity, the odds are good for slowing your rate of cognitive decline. Now, that's not something that I can guarantee, primarily for two reasons. One is that I'm not your doctor, and two, I'm a Ph.D., not an M.D., so I'm not anyone's doctor. But the research literature would suggest that there is a good chance of slowing your rate of cognitive decline over time if you stick to Mediterranean combined with a low sodium diet, along with plenty of physical activity and social and intellectual activity. And when I say intellectual activity, I don't just mean crossword puzzles and Sudoku. I don't just mean brain aging, because what's going to happen is you're going to be really, really good at brain aging and Sudoku, and you'll be bad at everything else. So it's not going to kind of protect you against those other things. So it has to be sort of a whole life intellectual and social engagement. So that's what seems to be the most effective and gives you the biggest bang for your buck. Okay. All right. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Doctor, when you mentioned the calorie-restricted diet,
Yes.
you said who would want to live on 4,000 calories a day? Did you mean 400?
So it can be anywhere between 400 and, sorry, I did mean 400. I don't know why I said 4,000. So 200, I guess I added a zero because maybe 4,000 is caloric restriction for me at this point. No, so I did mean something like 200 to 400 depending on your size. So it is pretty severe caloric restriction. So I apologize for my fake news moment there. I did mean measuring your calorie count in the hundreds per day rather than thousands.
So I
Yes?
have another question. There's a doctor in town who does talks on Alzheimer's, and he says that if you have 12 hours, like if you eat your last food at 6 o'clock at night, don't eat again until 6 o'clock in the morning, because it helps the brain to rest, and that can help prevent or not accelerate Alzheimer's. What do you think?
So yeah, so I know we've done a lot of science today. I'm going to teach you one more scientific thing today, and this is probably the most important of everything that I've said because it applies to. Yes, ma'am.